how do we argue for the existence of God out of the first line of Genesis? So to do that, let's go to Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And so right here, that's the first two lines, and I'll actually continue. So, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So before I get into the second and third line, I want to focus on the first one, which is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right here, what we see is what is essentially the foundation of what we know as the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory essentially being this idea that for our universe, there was a beginning of our universe. And this is based in science, this is based in, within secular humanistic thought. Our universe is a finite entity. It has a beginning, and we can measure that with numbers, we can measure that, with the means of science that we have in observing the natural world. And so what do we do with that? Well, right here, the biblical text affirms precisely that. And it's kind of weird that, with the Big Bang Theory, which came out of the inspiration of this line, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, we have to, if we accept the Big Bang Theory, in accepting that the universe is finite and that there was a beginning, presuppose that something created that everything, something created the universe. And so this is where we get into matters of spirituality. And so I was engaging with my friend on this, and I learned something really important, which was when engaged with people that don't believe, in God, or are atheist and don't believe in any kind of spiritual reality, what we have to do is establish, okay, is there a thing or something that is a spiritual reality? Do spiritual realities exist? And what we do when we can establish that is, first, we essentially are able to, set the terms of the conversation. If somebody doesn't believe that there is human spirit or that humans have a soul, well, that's a sign that the conversation should probably go another way, which is, well, throughout the corpus of human history, all people can agree on one thing, and that is that there is, in fact, a spiritual reality, which may not be the silver bullet proof people might want when it comes to accepting a spiritual world, but if this is the case and people or the person you're engaging with doesn't agree that human beings have a soul, then you first have to engage with them at that level. Do human beings have a soul? Yes or no? However, for the sake of time, let's just say the person says, yes, I can agree that human beings have a soul and that, there's something that separates us from all other living beings. Then the conversation can kind of take another direction. And this is where we get into Genesis, right? So when it comes to spiritual matters, we can understand at the very least the spiritual world exists on a plane of existence that transcends space, time, and matter. In other words, eternity. And here in Genesis 1:1, we see a person, the author of Genesis, engaging with the fundamental truth of the universe in a very simple, clear, and profound way. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, which simply means at the point in which all things began, and all perception began, and all consciousness began, two things happened. The creation of the perceived spiritual world by people, and the creation of the earthly world and the universe as we see it through observation, to the observation of the five senses. And why does that matter? It matters because if there is an entity that exists outside of space, time, and matter, that exists outside of the beginning or outside of the universe, as spoken of in Genesis 1:1, then wherever that eternity is, to some extent, we're going to engage and encounter that entity. And of course, the Christian claim would be that that entity is the triune God of Christianity. However, let's say you're an atheist. The atheist might pose that, in the beginning, nothing created Earth. And if you're maybe dealing with an agnostic, you're probably going to get something like, in the beginning, some form of abstract consciousness created the heavens and the earth. And then, respectively, each religion or each spirituality will presuppose their own theology and metaphysical truth claims onto that understanding of the universe and all things divine and earthly. And so here we see that in that declaration, in that understanding that there was an entity that created all things that are metaphysical and spiritual and earthly and physical, this entity in Genesis 1:2 takes the void, the formless nature of the universe, which is described as the face of the deep, and that entity essentially, by the very words of its mouth, says, "Let there be light," and there was light, right? And so this entity can speak things into existence. It can create order out of chaos, so to speak. And so why does that matter? Well, it matters precisely because when dealing with spiritual matters, you've got to understand we're dealing with things that are eternal. We're dealing with things that transcend space, time, and matter. We're dealing with things that are just beyond basic comprehension, that are beyond the means of which we can just understand basic reality. And that's very abstract, I know, but what is the point I'm trying to make? Well, we can all agree that at some point, all human beings will die. At the end of our lives, we will die and pass on into some form of eternal reality. We'll pass on to some form of eternity, right? Because death is eternal. There's no coming back from that. And so, what do we do with that? Well, it matters because the way we incline our wills throughout the course of our lives affects our spiritual disposition. It affects the manner upon which our souls carry themselves. And so in this life, we have a sort of, I don't know if duty is the right word, but we have a sort of desire to mold our souls into a certain disposition. And so, let's just say that objectively in this state of eternity, whatever that entity that created the heavens and the earth is the entity upon which we will encounter at our departure, because when we die, we enter into a form of eternal rest or eternal life or some kind of eternity. When we encounter and engage with that entity that exists there, whether it be God, some form of abstract consciousness, or nothingness itself, our wills are best served aligning our spiritual disposition to the will of the entity that created everything. And so, how do we argue for God with that understanding? Well, it begins with this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. What do we do with that? Well, what is the God that is described here in Genesis? Of course, the Christian claim is that this God is the God of Christianity, the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But if you're dealing with an agnostic, like somebody that, or the person that I was engaged with, this person might argue for some form of abstract consciousness where, there is a divine entity out there. We might not know what it is, or there is a divine and eternal reality out there, and we don't know what that entity is, but it's there, it's real, and it's unquestionably undeniable. And then the atheist might argue, well, it's just nothing. When we go into eternity, we go into eternal nothing. Well, that actually is a much bigger deal than we realize. Because if we're going to pass on, and our will and our spiritual disposition is naturally malaligned or naturally disinclined to the will of the entity that created everything, we're going to be stuck in a state of eternal conflict with the entity that created everything, that created spirituality itself and created the universe itself. And so perhaps the argument for God here is something like, whatever created the beginning, the universe and the heavens and divinity and space, time, and matter, we should align our wills to that, so that when we pass on in harmony with that entity, such that we can live in, a form of, what's the word for it? Theosis might be the best word I can think of. Forgive me if I'm just sort of speaking off the cuffs here. But we can live essentially in harmony with that entity. And so if it's nothing that created the heavens and the earth, then we should spend our lives on this planet becoming nothing, so that by the end of our life, our wills are inclined to the will of nothing. So let's say it's a form of abstract consciousness. If it's abstract consciousness that created everything, and that's what we encounter when we depart into eternity, then we should spend our lives in a state of abstract consciousness, not knowing anything for certain, living in a sort of tumultuous fluidity of not knowing absolute truth. But if it is the triune God of Christianity, well then it becomes a matter of how do we align our wills to the will of Jesus Christ. And this same thing applies to all religion, Hinduism, Buddhism, or Islam, let's say. If the claims of Hinduism and Islam and Buddhism are true, then in order to best align ourselves with the eternal state upon which we will enter, we have to know as much as we can about the theology and the spirituality of that system of spirituality, such that when we go into eternity, the divine being that we encounter, we are in harmony with, and that we are in good standing with. Because it matters, because if we're deposed in a certain way against the entity of nothing that created everything, well then we're going to be in a spiritual state of, conflict with nothing. And so that to me sounds like hell. And if it's some form of abstract consciousness that we engage with upon entering eternity, and we live our whole lives convicted in absolutes, and that's not the natural state of eternity, it's not absolutes, then we're in conflict with the divine entity of abstract consciousness. And so we sort of create in ourselves a sort of hell, and that same claim can be applied to all the religions. If we're deposed against the, Hindu spirituality or the Buddhist spirituality or the Islamic spirituality, then our wills are going to be against that divine entity. And so it's just going to be eternity of conflict, which is what that hell state would be like. And so with that being said, at the very least, I think there is some form of sound, metaphysical claim when looking at the creation account in Genesis in this manner. And so then the question becomes, well, how do we know it's the triune God of Christianity that is the God that created the heavens and the earth? Well, it's precisely in the fact that the origin of these stories in Genesis and of this creation account leads directly to Jesus Christ. And the only sort of continuity we see over the course of thousands of years and over the course of the biblical narrative is the story of Jesus Christ. That this same God, whatever God is depicted in Genesis 1:1-3, is the same God that engages with Adam and Eve, is the same God that engages with Cain and Abel, the same one that engages with Noah and his family, the same one that engages with the people that built the Tower of Babel, engaged with Abraham and his kids, and the same one that engaged with Joseph in the story in Genesis where Joseph is exiled to Egypt, the same God that engages with the Israelites throughout Exodus, Judges, and the story of Israel throughout the Old Testament. And in turn, in the New Testament, we see the culmination of that, or a culmination of that, in the narrative of Christ throughout the Gospels and the New Testament. And so I suppose I'll close with the following, which is John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him, and without him not anything was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Well, why does that matter? Well, it matters because, if the biblical narrative is true, then objectively, we should spend our time trying to align our wills with the will of the entity that created the universe. Because if it's eternity upon which we enter when we die, then if our spiritual wills are deposed or against the will of that entity we encounter, then we will be in a spiritual state of conflict, which is just essentially hell. There needs to be, as much as there is an emphasis on evangelization, a need for intellectual apologetics when preaching the gospels to people and preaching on the existence of God, and being able to lay out a thread of continuity between metaphysical claims, the biblical narrative, and the spiritual life we are all called to have when it comes to inclining our wills to the will of the entity that created the heavens and the earth. So with that, till my next video, God bless, and get out there and make better happen daily.